Hey guys, so today I'm actually going to go over Candida. We're going to talk about Candida and yeast overgrowth because I get so many questions on this topic, and just like everything else I talk about, it has a root cause, but I want you to understand the root cause so you can be empowered and not confused in your health decisions. And before I get started, I'll just, summarize everything. You have to cut carbs to heal Candida. Just kidding, but I'm sure you've been told that. So it's just not that simple, guys. The body's not that simple. And so if somebody tells you that, I hope that just reminds you how silly that is. So before we get started with this, I just want to give you that disclaimer and just remind you, this is not medical advice. I hope that you take this advice as education and inspiration, and it kind of springboards your own research. And, just a reminder, if you're going to say something stupid like show me a research study, just stop for a second and don't ask me that stupid question, because this is all based on physiology. So you can study yeast, you can study, the body, you can study your biology and get these answers. No research study is going to prove to you these things, but this is pretty apparent throughout Dr. Ray Peat's work. I think that Dr. Lita Lee talks about it a lot, so you can definitely find those resources in the pro-metabolic sphere. But most people are coming to me talking, they're always asking, like, I just don't know if I can heal my Candida and eat carbohydrates at the same time. Mostly because they've been told by someone, like a functional medicine doctor or something like that, that you cannot get rid of Candida without starving it. But I always counter-argue and say it's actually impossible to get rid of an overgrowth without eating carbohydrates. And here's why. Candida albicans is actually a normal part of our intestinal flora. So our goal is not to kill and starve Candida, because that's nearly impossible. Most of the population has Candida living inside of them. It's more about getting rid of the overgrowth. And so what is our magic question, ladies? The question is always why. Why is it happening in the first place? It is never how do I get rid of it. We never ask how. How doesn't really matter. It's why is there an overgrowth issue in the first place? Why is Candida overgrowing in a body that's supposed to keep it in check? And there is where our answer will lie. Now, I think it's absolutely hilarious. When I hear that people have been told that they can starve Candida by not eating carbohydrates or sugar, it's hilarious to me. It's actually funny. I actually laugh every time that I hear it because it's just so bizarre. It's not really possible to starve Candida in the sense of you starve it and it just wastes away and dies, oh my god, I'm starving, and then just withers and dies. That's not how yeast works. You would have to starve and kill yourself in the process, and that's just stupid. And that's what most people are doing. They're not realizing that they're cutting all sources of fuel for every single one of their cells to kill something that is there in the first place for a completely different reason. And you know what I'm gonna say? To get rid of a yeast problem, a yeast overgrowth problem, because it's not really about killing Candida, it's about getting rid of the overgrowth, you've got to heal your metabolism. You've got to restore that metabolism because there's a metabolic issue that's driving the yeast overgrowth. So we're going to go over what that is. And we're going to talk about what happens when you do try to starve Candida. Of course, your cortisol levels shoot up because you're restricting glucose from your cells, and so now you have to make it by breaking down your muscle tissue and your liver tissue. But did you ever contemplate that starving Candida might even make a Candida issue worse? Because I see most people that go on Candida diets, which are very low sugar, low carbohydrate diets, what happens is they feel better for a short period of time, mostly because of adrenaline and cortisol, because they're restricting carbohydrates. And then when they go back to eating like normal again, their Candida comes back with such a vengeance, it's worse than before. And there is a reason for that. So did you know that sugar is not the only thing that makes Candida grow? Estrogen does too. And so many times yeast is actually an estrogen dominance issue, because the more estrogen that's accumulating, or the more estrogen that's in the digestive tract, or the more estrogen that's not being eliminated properly, the faster yeast will grow. And so really, in reality, yeast is usually an estrogen issue. For most women, this is why it's so common for women who have estrogen dominance or estrogen accumulation or who are on the birth control pill to get really bad yeast infections, because it's forcing yeast to grow. It's a reproductive hormone, not just for humans, but for yeast as well. So yes, of course, sugar and carbohydrates do feed yeast, but this idea of yeast being fed shouldn't like fill us with terror, because there's a reason why we actually want to keep yeast fed and keep it localized in the digestive tract. And as long as our hormones are balanced and our immune system is functioning properly, usually our body keeps this yeast in check, and it belongs in the intestinal tract or the digestive tract. But once yeast is starved of sugar, what happens is it needs sugar. And like I said, it doesn't just lay down and die. It's a microorganism that needs sugar at all costs. And it has something called filaments, which we can kind of think of these long, invasive, finger-like projections that can actually permeate through cells and go through our intestinal cell walls, open them up, and then the yeast begins to become systemic and gets into the bloodstream. Now, when this happens, oftentimes our white blood cells will take care of it, or we would die. And there are people that will get systemic yeast infections, and it's usually because of like a surgical complication or diabetes or something like that. But these are usually the people that are used as like horror stories, like you can die of a systemic yeast infection. It's usually because the white blood cells aren't taking care of it. But this is how yeast can make it into the sinuses and the vaginal microbiome. It can make it into the skin microbiome, and it can cause all types of issues, fungal, foot infections and scalp issues, dandruff, and other kind of skin issues, and yeast infections in the vagina, those types of things. But usually our body is strong enough to keep it in check, enough to keep it from killing us, but it can become a pervasive problem if we don't deal with it properly. And this is usually just a sign of a deeper issue. If our body's unable to keep yeast in check, we have to ask ourselves why. Because nourished yeasts that just stay in the digestive tract usually don't actually cause a problem as long as our immune system is functioning and our metabolism is functioning really well. And these are usually the two things that are not working well. So there's 4 imbalances we want to keep in mind when yeast overgrowth is a problem for us, and it has nothing to do with carbohydrates. Now, number 1, I already kind of mentioned, which is estrogen. Now, estrogen dominance, estrogen accumulation, estrogen in the tissues will make it more likely for yeast to tack onto those cells, or just estrogen is going to feed yeast and yeast will proliferate. And so estrogen dominance can definitely be a huge driver of yeast issues. So as we deal with estrogen and estrogen starts to move out of our tissues, which happens a lot in my online course, Fully Nourished, sometimes, gut issues can get a little bit worse before they get better, because as estrogen moves and is actually eliminated from the body, that does end up in the digestive tract and therefore can feed a yeast problem that's already there. But as long as you're getting that estrogen out, usually it improves over time. We shouldn't overlook phytoestrogens. Remember, estrogens that are in our environment are called xenoestrogens, so those foreign estrogens, endocrine disruptors found in plastics and really toxic hygiene products and cleaning products. We want to be aware of endocrine disrupting estrogens or xenoestrogens, because those can feed yeast, and phytoestrogens. So remember, if you're doing tons of nuts and seeds and tons of beans and grains and tons of estrogenic food, you're going to find that your yeast problem is not getting better, even if you're cutting sugar, because estrogen feeds yeast. And as we can, the more estrogens we're exposed to, the more estrogens we consume, the more estrogen dominant we will become. And so that can absolutely contribute to our Candida overgrowth or our fungal issues. So we need to be aware of this and remember that it is absolutely a factor. And if we're estrogen dominant, we've got estrogen accumulation in the tissues, we've got low progesterone, we've got low thyroid function, we've got high stress. All these things are going to really affect how we're detoxifying estrogen and eliminating estrogen. And then we add tons of phytoestrogens and xenoestrogens on top of that, and we're in a pretty estrogenic environment, and that yeast is just going to grow and grow and grow and grow, and our body won't be able to keep it in check if it's not strong enough to do so. Factor number 2 is polyunsaturated fats. PUFAs are yeast stimulants, both omega-6s and omega-3s. This is why so many of my students in Fully Nourished immediately start to see their digestive issues get so much better so quickly, is because Fully Nourished is pretty much PUFA free for this reason. We want to reduce the stress burden on both the digestive tract and the hormones, and we want to switch out those polyunsaturated fats for fat-soluble, vitamin-rich saturated fats. And this is definitely one of the reasons why they see such change, is because polyunsaturated fats really wreak havoc on enzyme production in the pancreas. They do burden the gallbladder quite a bit, also the liver, obviously. And then they're also going to be yeast stimulants. And so just removing those PUFAs really makes a big difference for yeast overgrowth. Keep in mind, we're going to find PUFAs in a lot of natural foods. That's not what I'm talking about, but we often grow up eating so many polyunsaturated fats in the form of canola oil and soybean oil and Crisco and all the junk that all our food that's in all our processed food and fast food. It can be very therapeutic to just focus on some saturated fats for a while, keep your diet very PUFA low, and restore the vitamin E and the vitamin A that's been depleted from eating so many polyunsaturated fats for so long. Now, the third factor really in Candida overgrowth is really hypothyroidism. So when I talk about hypothyroidism a lot, it's hypothyroidism of the cell, meaning that we're not converting T4 to T3, or if we are, our cells aren't uptaking it, our tissues aren't uptaking it properly. So we could look like we have normal thyroid levels in the bloodstream, but in reality our metabolism is under functioning because our cells don't have the nourishment they need, or our stress hormones and stress levels are so high that's suppressing our metabolic function. So when I talk about hypothyroidism, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a slow or under-functioning metabolism that's being reflected to you in both low temps and pulses, or suboptimal temps and pulses, or your symptoms, not just lab tests. So, because so many people are like, well, my thyroid's fine, and it's like, no, like your hands and feet are cold, your temps and pulses are low, like you might want to recheck that and check into that. So it's about more of an under-functioning metabolism. But remember, when somebody has hypothyroidism or their metabolism is under functioning, they're going to be deficient in the antibody IgA. And so IgA is an antibody that protects us against a lot of things, including protect the yeast from adhering to the cells. This is where we really run into a problem. And so, you're going to have this yeast overgrowth because your immune system is now under functioning, but it's all because of an under functioning metabolism. That is what came first. And so you're starting to see maybe that, oh, it's not really yeast that's my problem. Yeast is just a symptom of a bigger problem. The fourth and last factor we're going to talk about today has to do a lot with nourishment. So this nutrient is by no means more important than things like vitamin A or other fat-soluble vitamins or vitamin C or other minerals, but I want to particularly highlight the role of copper with yeast. And I'm not going to dive too much into it, but remember that copper is really like the second most important mineral in the body besides magnesium. Many people are deficient in copper nowadays because we're not consuming these copper-rich foods, usually which are organ meats. And so copper is not only an energy conductor, but we know that copper is very protective against bacteria and other pathogens. It's very antifungal and very antibacterial. And so you can think about, if we're low in this mineral, we're not getting enough bioavailable copper from our food, we don't have a mineral, this vital mineral that plays a role in keeping our body protected against fungal overgrowth. And so of course fungus is going to become a problem. So copper is mostly found in organ meats. This is why I'm a huge fan of grass-fed beef liver, and you find that it's a nutrient-dense food that I recommend you consume at least once a week in Fully Nourished, as well as oysters, which are also very rich in copper as well. And then remember that all food-based sources of vitamin C, citrus, and things like that, camu, acerola cherry, those all are going to be amazing sources of bioavailable copper as well. Anything that has whole foods vitamin C in it. And so oftentimes when you're on a Candida diet, you're restricting these fruits, and oftentimes people are not eating enough organ meats, and it's just a recipe for disaster. Nothing's going to improve over time. It's just going to keep being this like, I feel a little better, now I feel worse. I feel a little better, and now I feel worse, because at the end of the day, we're just not dealing with the problem. So with all that being said, I hope that you've recognized now that Candida overgrowth is a symptom of a bigger problem. Candida should not be demonized. Remember that when Candida is a part of a healthy ecosystem, it actually produces ethanol, and ethanol is actually wonderful for the digestive tract. It keeps our gut very, very happy. But when that IgA is low and there's an underfunctioning metabolism, it then becomes, it starts to create toxic byproducts, which then actually can shrink the digestive tract and cause all types of problems. So again, yes, yeast overgrowth will definitely cause symptoms for a lot of people, but is it the problem or is it just a symptom of a larger problem? And then I know a lot of people are going to ask me about thrush, which is that thick white coating on the tongue. Just remember that, our mouth is just the flower of our digestive tract or our gut. And so, if we have a really imbalanced ecosystem in the mouth, we have a thick white coating, our breath is really smelly, we have really bad breath, it's just a sign of really bad bacterial imbalance or fungal overgrowth or just an overall imbalanced ecosystem. And usually as we improve our body and, we improve our metabolism, our gut will improve and that will improve. But we can take good steps to take care of our oral health, just making sure we're flossing and brushing. We can water floss with antibacterial essential oils, or I'll do like a food grade hydrogen peroxide. Rinsing with baking soda can help. Rinsing with a little bit of sulfur powder mixed in water can be very antifungal. Sulfur is very antifungal. So those are all things that we can do, but at the end of the day, we need to work on it as a whole, especially if it's not improving. Our mouth is just going to be a representation of what's going on in the digestive tract. So if Candida is just a symptom of a larger problem, which is really just low metabolic function and an underfunctioning immune system, then of course the fix for it is to actually start focusing on restoring our metabolism, which will therefore support our immune system. And eating sugar is actually going to support this because it's going to keep our cortisol levels down. So when we keep our stress down, our thyroid function is going to pick up, which will therefore increase our IgA antibodies and help our body actually deal with estrogen and support our progesterone production, which will therefore help with the yeast long term. And so cutting sugar to get rid of yeast is absolutely counterproductive and counterintuitive and will make yeast invasive. But I teach, the low PUFA lifestyle, getting the proper balance of protein, carbs, and fats from the right sources, lowering the stress on your body, the raw carrot salad. These are all principles that I teach in my online course, Fully Nourished. And so when people ask, is Fully Nourished appropriate for gut issues? Anything that's going to work on restoring your metabolism is appropriate for gut issues because usually the metabolism is broken when there's gut issues. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this kind of expanded your research and your knowledge on yeast, and I'll see you soon.